Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV. We here are lifelong Catholics, and what we do here is all for free, in love of Jesus Christ and the Most Holy Trinity and His Holy Church. It'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Our work is the true sense of apostolate. Any funds raised goes back into this work for equipment. This helps us to give you an unbiased, hard-hitting truth that is not controlled by political correctness or interest groups. Today's topic is Henry Ford and the Nazi Party. And welcome Brother Alexis to the show.
Thank you, AJ, for having me back on Order Militaris Radio TV, and especially for this series from Sutton about the true history of the 20th century and how Freemasonry was behind it. Henry Ford is an American icon. You know, you never hear in school anything bad about Henry Ford, but to find out he was the first Nazi industrialist is really just shocking. And this is what we'll talk about today, how there is no way Henry Ford played this role without Hitler having been chosen by American bankers to take over Germany from the beginning. And this is the shocking evidence in this chapter that Sutton lays out. So Henry Ford, who was he? What was his views on politics? What on earth is he doing in putting a hand in German politics?
It starts off, I'd like to outline the importance attached by high Nazi officials to respect the desire and maintain the goodwill of Ford. And by Ford, I mean your father, yourself, and the Ford Motor Company. Josiah E. Dubois, Jr., Generals in Gray Suits, published in London. So Henry Ford is often seen to be something of an enigma among the Wall Street elite. For many years in the 20s and 30s, Ford was popularly known as an enemy of the financial establishment. Ford accused Morgan and others of using war and revolution as a road to profit and their influence in social systems as means of personal advancement. By 1938, Henry Ford, in his public statements, had divided financiers into two classes: those who profited from war and used their influence to bring about war for profit, and the constructive financiers. Among the latter group, he now included the House of Morgan. During a 1938 New York Times interview, Ford averred that somebody once said that 60 families have directed the destinies of the nation. It might well be said that if somebody would focus the spotlight on 25 persons who handle the nation's finances, the world's real war makers would be brought into bold relief.
So here we have it from one of the horse's mouths. We're not making it up. Here's Ford, extremely wealthy man, highly informed, moved in the circles. He himself said it was the bankers of New York who were behind all the wars of the 20th century. And yet he, in strict Masonic style, he's painted this picture of good and bad financiers or good and bad industrialists, and as if he's a good one. Oh, was he?
The Times reporter asked Ford how he equated this assessment with his long-standing criticism of the House of Morgan, to which Ford replied, "There is a constructive and destructive Wall Street. The House of Morgan represents the constructive. I have known Mr. Morgan for many years. He backed and supported Thomas Edison, who was also my good friend."
Okay, so there it is. He's just admitted that he is a good friend of one of the Skull and Bones members, because Morgans are Skull and Bones. And
I wonder what Thomas Edison has to do with this.
Thomas Edison was an inventor, and he got big financing, and that's why you heard of Edison Electric, and they really backed him. But they backed him in such a way as to take his patents and make money off of him, and use him kind of like a bully against other inventors like Marconi and Telsa. So stealing patents from Telsa, actually, Edison.
After expounding on the evils of limited agricultural production, allegedly brought about by Wall Street, Ford continued, "If these financiers had their way, we'd be in a war now. They want war because they make money out of such conflict, out of the human misery that wars bring."
He said this in 1938.
Yep.
You know, they don't hide what they're up to and why they do it.
Mm-mm.
So if anyone thinks the programs we've done, or Sutton, or even Sutton himself, is exaggerating, or he's anti-capitalist, or he's just attacking the American system, here you have it from Ford's own mouth, what they're involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been totally censored from public education in America. You never hear Ford quoted as saying that in your textbook.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we probe behind these public statements. We find that Henry Ford and son Edsel Ford have been in the forefront of American businessmen who try to walk both sides of every ideological fence in search of profit. Using Ford's own criteria, the Fords are among the destructive elements. It was Henry Ford who, in the 1930s, built the Soviet Union's first modern automobile plant, located at Gorky, in which in the 50s and 60s produced the trucks used by the North Vietnamese to carry weapons and munitions to use against Americans. At about the same time, Henry Ford was also the most famous of Hitler's foreign backers, and he was rewarded in the 1930s for the long-lasting support with the highest Nazi decoration for foreigners. This Nazi favor aroused a storm of controversy in the United States and ultimately degenerated into the exchange of diplomatic notes between the German government and the States Department. While Ford publicly protested that he did not like totalitarian governments, we find in practice that Ford knowingly profited from both sides of the World War II, from French and German plants producing vehicles at a profit for the Wehrmacht, and U.S. plants building vehicles at a profit for the U.S. Army. Henry Ford's protestations of innocence suggest, as we shall see in this chapter, that he did not approve of Jewish financiers profiting from the war, as some have. But if anti-Semitic Morgan and Ford profited from the war, that was acceptable, moral, and constructive.
Mm-hmm. So he was a perfect hypocrite.
Mm-hmm.
His God was only money.
Now, Henry Ford, Hitler's first foreign backer.
His first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what's the story here?
On December 20th, 1922, the New York Times reported that automobile manufacturer Henry Ford was financing Adolf Hitler's nationalist and anti-Semitic movements in Munich. Simultaneously, the Berlin newspaper Berliner Tageblatt appealed to the American ambassador in Berlin to investigate and halt Henry Ford's intervention into German domestic affairs. It was reported that Hitler's foreign backers had furnished a spacious headquarters with a host of highly paid lieutenants and officials. Henry Ford's portrait was prominently displayed on the walls of Hitler's personal office.
Okay, so these facts of history completely blow away the narrative that Hitler was a self-made man and that his own political genius brought him to power in Germany, and that the Germans just willingly accepted him as their dictator for life and weren't manipulated into it by foreign powers. Here's absolute proof. And this this is very important. If Hitler has a picture of Ford in his office, paid for by Ford, in 1922, when he's unknown, okay, he's just like unknown in 1922. His party doesn't come to power until 3032, 10 years later. how does Ford know this guy? I mean, it's not like Ford grew up in Germany or he's German. Ford is from Michigan, Chicago area, New York at most. He would have no knowledge of this guy, except, as Sutton has already demonstrated in his other book, Brown Brothers Harriman, who financed Tyson Coal and Steel Company in 1921, 22, and they're the ones who recruited Hitler. So that means this was a board decision of the lodge in New York. The bankers, industrialists, they must have discussed Hitler by name in New York City, in some Masonic hall or in private meeting or golf course. They knew who this guy was, they chose him, and they shared the information among one another so they'd get to know who this guy was when he was still a nobody.
Yeah.
And Hitler, if Hitler has a picture of Ford on the wall in his room, then when Hitler says at the end in 1945, what become of the Nazi party, and he says, it will return in 100 years as a religion, he's not talking about something that his party will do, really. He's talking about the people who created his party, what they're planning to do. And that means he was deeply involved in the whole scheme of plan and control. And this is a century-long project. It was plotted back in the 1920s, a century ago. And this is why Skull and Bones, when they formed the CIA under Roosevelt and Eisenhower, they recruit the entire Nazi spy network, MK Ultra state, into the U.S. government. So the U.S. government wins the war. The U.S. wins the war, but the Nazis actually take control of the U.S. government. Not because Germans invaded us, but because the supporters of the Nazis were already in the United States, and the bankers of New York City.
Yep. Now
this is really devastating. 1922, he's financing Hitler when Hitler was an unknown.
Goes into detail what's in his private office, Hitler's private office. The wall behind his desk in Hitler's private office is decorated with a large picture of Henry Ford. In the antechamber, there is a large table covered with books, nearly all of which are translation of a book written and published by Henry Ford.
So this is like his patron of patrons here.
The same New York Times reports commented that the previous Sunday, Hitler had reviewed the so-called storming battalion, 1,000 young men in brand new uniforms and armed with revolvers and black jackets, while Hitler and his henchmen drove around in two powerful brand new autos.
Were the automobiles Ford automobiles?
The Times made a clear distinction between the German monarchist parties and Hitler's anti-Semitic fascist party. Henry Ford, it was noted, ignored the Hohenzollern monarchists. So he's a family enemy. Cool.
Hohenstaufen. The Hohenstaufen family are the family that ruled Prussia. Okay, came to rule Prussia. They were once Catholic, but they gave up the Catholic faith, became Lutheran heretics, and they're that's the Kaiser of Prussia. He's Hohenstaufen.
And put his money into the Hitlerian revolutionary movement. These Ford's funds were used by Hitler to foment the Bavarian Rebellion. The rebellion failed and Hitler was captured and subsequently brought to trial. In February 1923, at the trial, Vice President Albert of Bavarian Diet testified. The Bavarian Diet has long had the information about that the Hitler movement was partly financed by an American anti-Semitic chief, who is Henry Ford. Mr. Ford's interest in the Bavarian anti-Semitic movement began a year ago when one of Mr. Ford's agents seeking to sell tractors came in contact with Dietrich Eckart, the notorious pan-German. Shortly after Herr Eckart asked Mr. Ford's agent for financial aid. The agent returned to America, and immediately Mr. Ford's money began coming to Munich. Hitler openly boasts of Mr. Ford's support and praises Mr. Ford as a great individualist and a great anti-Semite. A photograph of Mr. Ford hangs in Herr Hitler's quarters, which is center of monarchist movement.
Well, Hitler wasn't a monarchist at all. That's just complete fraud. But one thing this reveals is a lot of the rhetoric after the Second World War, especially from Jews, is that Hitler was a Catholic and anti-Semitism is Christian prejudice. But Ford was not a Catholic. Okay, Ford was anti-Catholic. Now, it's a historic fact that Hitler was raised a Catholic and he was baptized in the Catholic Church, received the sacraments of the Catholic Church, and he was seen by many in Bavaria as a Catholic. And to a certain extent, his party was seen as Catholic only because Bavarians are Catholics. But why would Ford, who hates Catholics, pour money into a German non-monarchical party in Bavaria to take over Catholic Bavaria? It could only be because he knew that Hitler wasn't a Catholic at heart, and that he was willing to serve their Masonic agenda of destroying the Catholic Church. Because if you want to destroy a country, you try to destroy the part of it you hate most, and this is about infiltration. They're experts in infiltration. So the anti-Semitism here isn't coming from Germany. It's not even coming from the German people. Hitler's not German. All four grandparents are Jewish. It's coming from the United States. It's coming from New York City, and it's coming from the Masonic Lodge. And that's the true history of the World War II and the 20th century.
Hitler received a mild and comfortable prison sentence for his Bavarian revolutionary activities. The rest from more active pursuits enabled him to write Mein Kampf. Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, earlier circulated by the Nazis, was translated by them into a dozen languages, and Hitler utilized sections of the book verbatim in writing Mein Kampf.
Hitler is a co-author of Ford is a whole co-author of Mein Kampf. Now this I've never heard said anywhere. Now talk about the censorship in American education when they say, oh, Mein Kampf, it's an evil book. It's evil, evil, evil. But did they mention that parts of it are quoted from Ford? Not a word in American history textbooks. That would really open up some eyes. Students would say, how is it the founder of Ford Motors being quoted by Hitler in his book? If Hitler's just came out of nowhere in Germany and is a German movement, why would he be quoting Hitler? So then you would connect the dots and to find out, well, the student would understand that the Nazi state is created in the boardrooms of American banks. It's not German at all. And all this guilt that's been thrown on the Germans. I'm not saying the Germans aren't guilty for following Hitler and doing what he told. They were. But they're not guilty for creating this monster. This monster was created in the United States, and America has never taken responsibility and never gone after the people who are really responsible.
Yeah.
So the next time you hear it claimed in political discourse that an American president could become a Hitler and you dismiss it because it's totally absurd, well, if he's supported by New York bankers, it may not be absurd. And matter of fact, all our presidents, I think all our presidents have been supported by New York bankers. So it's a lot more possible than we think, or maybe we're willing to admit.
Yeah. We shall see later that Hitler's backing in the late 20s and early 30s came from the chemical, steel, and electrical industry cartels, rather than directly from individual industrialists. In 1928, Henry Ford merged with his German assets with those of the IG Farben chemical cartel.
Okay, so this proves that Ford knew about Hitler because he was part of the inner circle in New York City that was completely reconstructing the German economy and taking control of it. And he openly was collaborating because IG Farben, that was wasn't that a chase? That's That's Rockefeller, isn't
Yeah.
it? Rockefeller. Okay, so it's not a Morgan, but it's Rockefeller. So here you have clear evidence that they were working together in New York City.
So, substantial holding, 40% of Ford Motor AG of Germany was transferred to IG Farben. Karl Bosch of IG Farben became head of Ford AG Motor in Germany. Simultaneously in the United States, Edsel Ford joined the board of American IG Farben.
This is a really cushy relationship here.
Mm-hmm. A decade later, in August 1938, after Hitler had achieved power with the aid of the cartels, Henry Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, a Nazi decoration for distinguished foreigners. New York Times reported it was the first time the Grand Cross had been awarded in the United States, and was to celebrate Henry Ford's 75th birthday.
See, the Nazi state's not just a creation of the American industrialist, it's the hand of it. It's the hand and fingers.
The decoration raised a storm of criticism within Zionist circles in the U.S. Ford backed off to the extent of publicly meeting with Rabbi Leo Franklin of Detroit to express his sympathy for the plight of the German Jews. My acceptance of this medal from the German people, said Ford, does not, as some people seem to think, involve any sympathy on my part with the Nazism. Those who have known me for many years realize that anything that breeds hate is repulsive to me.
What an absolute hypocrite and liar. He wrote a whole book against Jews. And he has the gall to say those words. What a consummate liar this guy is.
Mm-hmm.
I can see why he hates the Catholic Church, because he hates truthfulness.
Mm-hmm. The Nazi medal issue was picked up in the Cleveland speech by Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes. Ickes criticized both Henry Ford and Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh for accepting Nazi medals. The curious part of the Ickes speech made at Cleveland Zionist Society banquet was his criticism of wealthy Jews and their acquisition of in use of wealth. A mistake made by a non-Jewish millionaire reflects upon him alone, but a false step made by a Jewish man of wealth reflects upon his whole race. This is harsh and unjust, but it is a fact that must be faced.
Well, the truth is that the corruption of Ford doesn't reflect only himself. It reflects the entire Yankee industrialist banking class, these so-called 65 families or 25 individuals. It shows that they are deeply immoral and profoundly anti-Christian people. And if we have to count, if we're going to measure anti-Christianity by who's responsible for killing more people, we'd have to say it's the Masonic bankers in New York, far more than any Jew in history, because as we've already talked about, they're responsible for the death of more than 160 million people in the 20th century. And I don't know any Jew who's even killed 10,000 Christians. Okay. So, wherever you are in the world, tone down your anti-Semitism here. The real problem is the lodge. Okay. And even though Hitler was of Jewish the race, he was being financed not by Jews, but by Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Perhaps Ickes was tangentially referring to the roles of the war bugs in IG Farben cartel. War bugs were on the board of IG Farben in US and Germany. In 1938, the war bugs were being ejected by the Nazis from Germany. Other German Jews, such as the Oppenheim bankers, made their peace with the Nazis and were granted honorary Aryan status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we mentioned there's 130,000 Jews who participated in the Nazi state. And it would be interesting to know, no one's yet done a book to see how many of them are behind the creation of the modern Israeli state. we've already connected a few dots there, and I wouldn't be surprised there's a lot more info if someone goes to the depths of researching it.
Yeah. Ford Motor Company assists the German war effort.
How does this begin? And
a post-war congressional subcommittee investigating American support for the Nazi military effort described the manner in which the Nazis succeeded in obtaining U.S. technical and financial assistance as quite fantastic. Among other evidence, the committee was shown a memorandum prepared in the offices of Ford Work AG on November 25, 1941, written by Dr. H. F. Albert to R. H. Schmidt, then president of the board of Ford Work AG. The memo cited the advantages of having a majority of the German firm held by Ford Motor Company in Detroit. German Ford had been able to exchange Ford parts for rubber and critical war materials needed in 1938 and 1939, and they would not have been able to do that if Ford had not been owned by the United States. Further, with majority American interest, German Ford would more easily be able to step up in and dominate the Ford holdings throughout Europe. It was even reported to the committee that two top German Ford officials had been in a bitter personal feud about who was to control Ford of England, such that one of them finally got up and left the room in disgust.
so his backing for Hitler was for the pure desire of controlling the automobile market in Europe. Took about really low morals. Let's kill the 20 million people so we can get the control of the automobile market.
Mm-hmm. According to evidence presented to the committee, Ford Work AG was technically transformed in the late 1930s into a German company. All vehicles and their parts were produced in Germany by German workers using German materials under German direction and exported to European and overseas territories of the United States and Great Britain. Any needed foreign raw materials, rubber, non-ferrous metals, were obtained through the American Ford Company. American influence had been more or less converted into a supporting position for the German Ford plants. At the outbreak of the war, Ford Work placed itself at the disposal of the Wehrmacht for armament production. It was assumed by the Nazis that as long as Ford Work AG had an American majority, it would be possible to bring the remaining European Ford companies under German influence, i.e. that of Ford Work AG, and so execute Nazi Greater European policies in the Ford plants in Amsterdam, Antwerp, Paris, Budapest, Bucharest, and Copenhagen.
Boy, this is really advanced planning. It's not only create this guy out of thin air, finance his party, and give him automobile factories, but let's give him our entire business network in Europe to promote his war effort.
A majority, even if only a small one, of Americans is essential for the transmittal of the newest American models, as well as American production and sales methods. But the abolition of the American majority, this advantage, as well as the intervention of the Ford Motor Company to obtain raw materials and exports would be lost, and the German plant would practically only be worth its machine capacity.
So it's basically the German factory couldn't work without constant supplies from the United States.
Mm. And of course, this kind of strict neutrality, taking an international rather than a national viewpoint, had earlier paid off the Ford Motor Company and the Soviet Union, where Ford was held in high regard as the ultimate of technical and economic efficiency to achieve by the Stakhanovites.
So he was doing the same policy in both countries.
Mm-hmm. In July 1942, word filtered back to Washington from Ford of France about Ford's activities on behalf of the German war effort in Europe. The incriminating information was promptly buried, and even today, only part of the known documentation can be traced in Washington.
Now, why would that be? What year was that? 1938, you say?
1942.
So Roosevelt was protecting Ford.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. In his anti-Semitic pro-Nazi war effort, doing it during the war too. So isn't that collaboration with the enemy? Do
Yep.
you find that someone in your country is actually helping the enemy build war machines, and you hide the information?
Mm-hmm. And it's still hidden in the State Department today.
I wouldn't be surprised how many secrets are there if they've already destroyed this stuff.
We do know, however, that the U.S. Consul General in Algeria had possession of a letter from Maurice Dollfus of French Ford, who claimed to be the first Frenchman to go to Berlin after the fall of France, to Edsel Ford about a plan by which Ford Motor could contribute to the Nazi war effort. French Ford was able to produce 20 trucks a day for the Wehrmacht, which, wrote Dollfus, is better than our less fortunate French competitors are doing. The reason is that our trucks are in very large demand by the German authorities, and I believe that as long as the war goes on, and at least for some period of time, all that we shall produce will be taken by the German authorities. I will satisfy myself by telling you that the attitude you have taken, together with your father of strict neutrality, has been an invaluable asset for the protection of your companies in Europe. Mm-hmm.
So American neutrality helped the German war effort.
And Dollfus disclosed that profits from this German business were already 1.6 million francs, and a net profit for 1941 were no less than 58 million francs, because the Germans paid promptly for Ford's output. On receipt of this news, Edsel Ford cabled, "Delighted to hear you are making progress. Your letters are most interesting. Fully realize great handicap you are working under. Hope you and family well. Regards, Edsel Ford."
It's so wonderful you're making money while killing 20, 40 million people. It's wonderful news.
How's
These
the
people are,
family?
yeah, produce a couple number of thousand trucks to haul those Jews off to Auschwitz, while you're at it. These people are such vicious monsters. And why are the Jews hunting down Pius XII and not Ford
Yeah,
Automobile Company? Why is that?
yeah. And why are they still in business?
Exactly. Why haven't they been assets been? Why war damages never been sought from Ford?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? I can tell you one thing. I'm going to tell everyone never to buy a Ford again.
Yeah. Although there is evidence that European plants owned by Wall Street interests were not bombed by U.S. Air Force in World War II, this restriction apparently did not reach the British Bombing Command. In March 1942, the Royal Air Force bombed the Ford plant at Poissy, France. A subsequent letter from Edsel Ford to Ford General Manager Sorensen about this RAF raid commented, "Photographs of the plant on fire were published in American newspapers, but fortunately no reference was made to the Ford Motor Company." In any event, the Vichy government paid Ford Motor Company 38 million francs as compensation for damages done to the Poissy plant. This was not reported in the U.S. press and would hardly be appreciated by those Americans war with Nazism. Du Bois asserts that these private messages from Ford in Europe were passed to Edsel Ford by Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long.
The U.S. Assistant Secretary of State was involved in covering this up?
Yeah.
Oh boy, talk about corrupt. This is the Roosevelt administration.
It gets
So
worse.
I guess Ford failed to bribe the Brits and tell them not to bomb your factory. But I ask you this. Okay, so you're building factories to build trucks for the Nazi war effort, and your factory gets bombed. I mean, who in wartime, when their factory gets bombed, gets paid by the government to rebuild it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is not just cushy close. This is really huggy kissy cushy close companies.
Yeah.
It gets worse. How can it get worse?
Oh, this same Secretary Long, who 1 year later suppressed private messages through the State Department concerning the extermination of Jews in Europe. Mm, yeah.
Oh my goodness. He
So
suppressed it.
yeah, yeah. Not just one. 16 disclosures of those messages conceivably could have been used to assist those desperate people.
So, Democrat Vice Secretary of State suppressed 16 messages that were revealing the Germans were exterminating hundreds of thousands of Jews, and he was never brought to trial for that.
Nope. Mm,
So, this is why I say if there's any anti-Nazis out there, anti-Nazi Jews, stop hunting Pius the 12th down. You got names right here to hunt in America, and you should make much of it.
yeah.
But I guess they don't want to hunt someone down in the Democrat Party. Maybe that's what it's all about.
Mm. Huh. The U.S. Air Force bombing intelligence report, written in 1943, noted that principal wartime activities of the Ford plant are probably manufacture of light trucks and spare parts for all Ford trucks, and cars in service in Axis Europe, including captured Russian Molotovs.
So it's definitely American bombers should have been bombing it.
Mm-hmm.
This is an amazing kind of war where the US is flying bombers over Germany and they're getting messages, don't bomb that factory, it's American, because if we bombed it, then the Germans wouldn't have the trucks to wage war against us. Meanwhile, send the American boys, the GIs, up to the front so they can get shot by the Germans who arrived in Ford trucks.
Yep.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the Russian Molotovs were, of course, manufactured by the Ford-built works at Gorky, Russia, and France during the war. Passenger automobile production was entirely replaced by military vehicles, and for this purpose, 3 large additional buildings were added to the Posse factory. The main building contained about 500 machine tools, all imported from the United States, including a fair sprinkling of more complex types, such as Gleason gear cutters, Bullard automatics, and Ingersoll borers.
So we're not just talking about a company owned by American corporation or financed by America or supplied by America. We're talking about it's full of American equipment. This is not even German machinery.
Yep. Ford also extended its wartime activities into North Africa. In December 1941, a new Ford company, Ford Afrique, was registered in France and granted all rights of former Ford Motor Company Ltd. of England and Algeria, Tanzania, French Morocco, French Equatorial, the French West Africa, North Africa, was not accessible to British Ford, so this new Ford company, registered in German-occupied France, was organized to fill the gap. The directors were pro-Nazi, including Maurice Dollfuss, Essel Ford's correspondent, Roger Messis, described by the U.S. Algiers Consul General as known to this office by repute as unscrupulous, is stated to be 100% pro-German. The U.S. Consul General also reported that propaganda was common in Algiers about the collaboration of French, German, American capital and the questionable sincerity of the American war effort there is already pointing an accusing finger at the transaction, which has been for long a subject of discussion in commercial circles.
Now I understand why the Americans were cut out the deal for them to liberate Algeria. The Brits wanted to do it, but no, the Americans were given it because, well, Ford had factories there. He couldn't affect his markets. And the countries you mentioned are all of French West Africa, which goes all the way down to Benin. So it's like the whole backside of the head of Africa. It's on a small market.
Yeah. Yeah. In brief, there is documentary evidence that Ford Motor Company worked on both sides of World War II. If the Nazi industrialists brought to trial at Nuremberg were guilty of crimes against mankind, and so must be their fellow collaborators in the Ford family, Henry and Ethel Ford. However, the Ford story was concealed by Washington, apparently like almost everything else that could touch upon the name and substance of Wall Street financial elites.
Mm-hmm. And thanks be to God, Sutton broke through the veil and revealed it all. Who are the true creators and backers of the Nazi state, and who are the ones that should have paid and never paid. And hopefully someday all the victims of World War II will get justice from these companies.
Yeah. So if you want justice out there, folks, if you're American, join the Christian Party for America.
Yeah, because obviously the Democrat and Republican Party will never make these companies pay because those parties are controlled by these companies.
Mm-hmm. That ends this chapter in let's see here, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. And
Anthony C. Sutton.
Yep. Next will be going into who financed Adolf Hitler. And there is a nice list of people. Names.
And how much they sent.
Oh, yeah. Names, dates, places, addresses. You know, if you want to protest, you can probably find them now. And next Wednesday's show, as Sutton gives the addresses
That they were back then in the 80s when he published that book.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. You can see why there's a lot of money behind keeping Sutton's discoveries out of the media. And the fact that we're talking about it here on Ordo Militaris Radio TV just proves that we're completely uncontrolled media, not like all the others have been gabbing for 10, 20 years and never told you this. Maybe because they don't know it and they don't do research. Maybe they don't read books, but maybe because they're financed by some of the people that cause the problem.
Yeah.
Because we'll be very frank with you, the total donations that Ordo Militaris Radio TV has gotten, like in the last, since what we started in June, I think has not exceeded even $1,000 for the equipment. Okay, so it's not like we've had any big money behind us, but we're out there to give you the truth. And if you appreciate our programming, help us to get better equipment so that we can add programs and give you better quality in production, and get independent from the platforms we use, so that you can be sure that the programs we produce, you will always be able to see and share.
Yep. And to do that now, you have to mail in your donation to Ordo Militaris Inc. The address will be on all of our show pages until we find another way for our European listeners to help us. You can go to ordo-militaris.us, go to the contact page, and the mailing address is there. And thank you, and please be generous. And to do it, you address your check to Order Militaris Inc. In the memo section of your check, you put Order Militaris Radio TV, and that's it. Plus your donation amount.
And thank you. Yeah, and thank you for your support of Order Militaris Radio TV. We try to do all this is non-commercial, and this is not for making money. This is informing you so that you can practice your liberty, and you can't practice Christian liberty unless you know what's going on in the world. So this is like legal aid, free legal aid, and encourage you to get all Sutton's books and put them on the bookshelf of your house and get your family members to read them in sometime in their lifetime, so that they get totally deprogrammed by all the propaganda that's put out.
Yep. So tomorrow we'll be covering more from this book, National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union. You want to know about censorship and how it all started? You're going to hear it tomorrow.
You mean it didn't start in Russia?
No.
You mean it started in America?
Yeah.
Imagine that.
And you want to know, and you might want to stay tuned for Friday's show, because we'll really get behind who's really behind all this evil. The Antichrist within.
Father Michelli.
Yep.
And great man, and he says some really profound things about the Masonic infiltration of state and church and academia, and what is their agenda.
Yep.
So thank you, AJ, for having me on this program for Order Militaris Radio TV. It's always a pleasure.
Yep. This is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. Deus Volt.
Deus Volt.